The sunken cathedral of whispers. The desiccated wind, carrying the scent of parched earth and distant forgotten pines, rasped against the reinforced window of the old scout vehicle. Elias Thorne watched the final vestiges of twilight bleed from the sky, painting the skeletal ridges of the Blackwood Mountains in shades of bruised indigo and charcoal. He had driven for 2 days, leaving the last flickering light of civilization far behind, navigating a labyrinth of crumbling logging roads that eventually dissolved into little more than game trails. Now, at the foot of a particularly monolithic, scarred peak, his journey's end lay shrouded in the deepening gloom. This was the entrance to Project Umbra, or what was rumored to be its entrance. A Cold War-era subterranean research facility, whispered to have delved into fields so esoteric and dangerous that its very existence was scrubbed from official records. Abandoned abruptly, supposedly due to funding cuts, but the stories that lingered spoke of something far more unsettling. Elias, a man whose life revolved around the rational dissection of the anomalous, sought to peel back the layers of dust and myth. He was a documentarian of the forgotten, an archivist of the unspoken, and this place, if the legends held an ounce of truth, promised to be his magnum opus, or perhaps his tomb. He killed the engine. The sudden, profound silence that descended was not empty, but heavy, thick with the weight of unseen things. It was the silence of a place that had held its breath for decades. Elias's own breathing, measured and steady, seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive quiet. He checked his equipment one last time. High-lumen headlamp, a military-grade flashlight, thermal imager, EMF detector, a portable air quality sensor, and his trusty audio recorder. His pack was heavy with rations, water, and contingency gear. He was prepared, or so he told himself. Stepping out of the vehicle, the cold bit instantly. It wasn't just the ambient temperature. There was an inexplicable, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the very ground, sinking into his bones despite his insulated layers. The wind, when it stirred, didn't rustle leaves. There were few left, but scraped against the exposed rock faces, a sound like ancient teeth grinding. Above, the first pinpricks of stars emerged, indifferent and remote. He'd painstakingly pieced together was not a grand portal, but a discreet incision in the mountainside. After a few minutes of methodical sweeping, the beam caught on a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration in the rock face, a darker rectangle against the already dark stone. As he drew closer, the details resolved. A massive, rusted steel blast door, its surface pockmarked with corrosion, almost perfectly camouflaged by a century's worth of erosion and clinging lichen. No visible hinges, no obvious handle, just a solid, unyielding slab of forgotten iron. A shiver traced its way down Elias's spine, not of cold, but of anticipation. This was it. He located the hidden release mechanism, a small recessed panel disguised as a natural fissure. His gloved fingers, precise and practiced, worked the ancient lock with a series of specialized tools. The mechanism groaned, a high-pitched, protesting whine that echoed unnaturally in the vast, still air. With a final, resonant clunk, the immense door shifted inward by a fraction of an inch, exhaling a gust of air that was stale, cold, and carried an indescribable scent. A mix of damp earth, ozone, and something else. Something metallic and faintly putrid, like old blood. Elias braced himself, then pushed. The blast door, weighing what felt like tons, moved with agonizing slowness, scraping against unseen friction points, sending shudders through the ground. The sound was deafening in the silence, a metallic shriek that seemed to tear the very fabric of the desolate landscape. It was the sound of a tomb opening, or a maw. Once a gap wide enough for him to slip through, he paused, shining his flashlight into the inky blackness beyond. Absolute, profound darkness. A darkness that seemed to actively absorb light rather than reflect it. His high lumen beam, usually capable of piercing through gloom, seemed to struggle here. Its cone of illumination strangely muted, almost swallowed. He stepped inside. The air immediately thickened around him, colder, heavier, and laden with the strange metallic tang. The door, released from his grasp, swung shut with a muffled, booming thud that vibrated through the rock. Now the silence was complete, utterly devoid of even the whispering wind. Elias was alone, submerged. His headlamp clicked on, its focused beam cutting a stark path through the impenetrable gloom. He found himself in a short, narrow antechamber, its walls concrete, stained with what looked like ancient water damage and streaks of rust. A second, smaller blast door, identical in its rusted fortitude, stood directly ahead. This one, mercifully, was ajar. Pushing it open, Elias entered the main complex. The initial impression was one of overwhelming scale. He stood at the precipice of a vast central shaft, its depths disappearing into the abyss below. Around him, a wide circular platform served as an entry point, with several darkened tunnels branching off into the unseen. The air here was even colder, a deep, pervasive chill that gnawed at his exposed skin. His headlamp beam struggled, unable to illuminate the full extent of the shaft, which seemed to plunge hundreds of feet into the earth. The walls, he could discern, were a patchwork of raw rock and reinforced concrete, studded with rusted gantries and defunct machinery, like the skeletal remains of some colossal, forgotten beast. A fine, pervasive dust coated everything, shimmering like phantom particles in his light. He took a moment to activate his audio recorder, then spoke into it, his voice sounding strangely hollow, absorbed by the immensity of the space. Entry point secured, initial assessment. Project Umbra, or the Blackwood Depths as some legends call it, is far larger than anticipated. Air quality seems stable, though the scent is peculiar. Deep chill. No visible signs of recent human activity. Complete desolation. Elias began his descent, following a winding metal staircase that hugged the inner wall of the shaft. Each step echoed with a metallic clang, the sound reverberating endlessly, losing itself in the unfathomable depths. His light danced ahead, revealing only patches of the decaying infrastructure, corroded pipes, defunct wiring snaking like dead vines, control panels caked in dust, their indicator lights long since extinguished. The descent was slow, deliberate. He stopped frequently, sweeping his thermal imager, checking his EMF detector. Nothing. No heat signatures, no electromagnetic fluctuations beyond the background static of deep Earth. Yet, an undeniable sense of presence began to prickle at the edges of his awareness. It was the feeling of being watched, not by eyes, but by the very air itself, by the silent, judging walls. Perhaps it was the isolation, the sheer weight of being so far removed from the surface world. Or perhaps it was the profound stillness, broken only by his own movements, that allowed the mind to conjure such things. As he reached what felt like the halfway point of the shaft, a new sound began to filter into the silence, a low, persistent hum. It was almost imperceptible at first, a vibration more felt than heard, a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock. Elias paused, switching off his headlamp and relying solely on the focused beam of his handheld. He listened intently. The hum was subtle, a low-frequency rumble that vibrated through the soles of his boots. His seismic sensors, usually hypersensitive, registered nothing. His ears, however, picked it up, a deep, guttural thrum that seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. Was it a geological phenomenon, a distant fault line, or something else entirely? Then another sound, distinct from the hum. A whisper. It was faint, almost snatched away by the vastness of the shaft. A dry, papery rustle, like old leaves skittering across a forgotten floor. But there were no leaves here, and it seemed to come from somewhere below him, drifting up through the darkness. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. He strained his ears, but the sound had vanished, replaced by the relentless, silent thrum. He dismissed it, a trick of the acoustics, perhaps the settling of the ancient structure, or even his own mind, playing tricks in the oppressive isolation. He continued his descent, the hum growing steadily louder, becoming a part of the environment, a deep, resonant chord in the subterranean symphony of dread. The air grew colder still, and the metallic tang intensified, now mixed with a faint, almost imperceptible scent of something acrid like burnt copper. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the bottom of the central shaft. Here, the hum was a constant, low throb that resonated through his entire body. The space opened into a sprawling network of corridors, far wider and more numerous than those on the upper level. Each tunnel, a gaping maw of darkness, beckoned into the unknown. He chose the largest, most central corridor, its entrance marked by a heavily corroded sign, its lettering illegible under years of grime. His light cut through the gloom, revealing a wide, concrete-lined passage stretching endlessly. On either side, heavy steel doors, each marked with a faded, numerical designation, stood like sentinels guarding untold secrets. The air in this corridor was completely still, so devoid of movement that the dust motes suspended in his headlamp's beam seemed to hang motionless like tiny glowing stars. It was a suffocating stillness. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, each sound magnified, reverberating down the corridor as if something were mimicking him, a beat behind. He stopped. The echo continued for a beat longer, then faded into the hum. He walked again, and the phantom footsteps returned. He tried to rationalize it. The acoustics of such a vast, empty space could be strange, disorienting. But the sensation persisted, a feeling of not being alone, of being accompanied by an unseen entity. After a long, unnerving traverse, the corridor opened into a larger chamber. This was not a natural cavern, but a man-made space of immense proportions. The ceiling was lost in the absolute darkness above his limited light, hinting at a vast, cathedral-like expanse. The walls were lined with what looked like banks of ancient, towering machinery, their complex structures obscured by shadows and draped in thick, velvety dust. Cables, thick as his arm, snaked across the floor like petrified serpents, leading into the gloom. This was clearly a primary research area, a command center, or perhaps a reactor chamber. The low hum here was stronger, almost physical, vibrating his teeth. He began to sweep the chamber with his light, documenting the decay, the rusting technology, the profound stillness. His thermal imager registered only the ambient cold. His EMF detector remained silent. The air quality sensor, however, flickered, registering trace elements it couldn't identify, labeling them simply as anomalous gases, unknown composition. Then he saw it. In the center of the vast chamber, amidst a cluster of what appeared to be control consoles, a single light pulsed. Faintly, rhythmically, with a soft internal glow that defied the decades of darkness and abandonment. It was a small, circular indicator light on a dust-covered console, a beacon in the absolute desolation. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of scientific curiosity and primal dread. He moved towards it, his footsteps now sounding too loud, too heavy in the unnerving quiet. As he drew closer, the hum intensified, seeming to emanate directly from the console, vibrating through the floor and up into his very core. The light pulsed with a faint, steady rhythm, an impossible spark of life in this tomb of forgotten ambition. It was amber, warm and inviting, yet utterly alien. He reached out a gloved hand, careful not to disturb the layers of dust, to examine the console more closely. The screen was dark, shattered in places, but this one indicator light persisted. Just as his fingers hovered above the ancient plastic, a distinct metallic clink echoed from somewhere behind him in the vast shadowed expanse of the chamber. It was a sharp, clear sound, like a small piece of metal dropping onto concrete, or perhaps a key turning in a lock. Elias spun around, his headlamp sweeping across the darkness, cutting violent arcs through the undisturbed dust. Nothing. Only the towering, silent machinery, the endless shadows, and the pervasive hum. He waited, straining his ears, but the sound was not repeated. He turned back to the console, his heart thrumming against his ribs. The amber light, he noticed, was pulsing brighter now, a little faster, as if it had reacted to the sound, or to his fear. And then, from the darkness directly behind him, closer than any echo could explain, a dry, raspy whisper slithered into his ear, clear and unmistakable, carrying a name that made his blood run cold. Elias. The name, dry and spectral, had been breathed directly into his ear, a sound that bypassed his eardrums and vibrated deep within the cochlea, a whisper woven from dust and cold. Elias Thorne spun, a visceral primal jerk, his headlamp beam tearing through the impenetrable darkness behind him. It sliced across the ancient machinery, illuminating rust-streaked steel and shadow-draped conduits, but found nothing. No form, no silhouette, no disturbance in the settled dust that coated every surface. Only the oppressive, all-consuming void. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the profound silence that had abruptly swallowed the metallic clink, and now even the low, resonant hum of the chamber seemed to falter, momentarily muted by the shock. He swept the light again, slower this time, his breath held tight in his chest. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to coalesce into something formless and vast. The air, already frigid, now felt like a block of ice pressing against his skin. "Hello?" he managed, his voice a strained croak, swallowed almost instantly by the immensity of the space. It sounded absurd, pathetic, an attempt at civility in the face of something utterly inhuman. No response, only the resumed, steady thrum, now feeling less like a mechanical vibration and more like the slow, deliberate pulse of a titanic, unseen heart. The amber light on the console before him, which he had momentarily forgotten, pulsed faster, brighter, a frantic beacon in the gloom. It felt like an eye watching him, judging his fear. Elias forced himself to breathe, to rationalize. Exhaustion, isolation, the mind's treacherous capacity for hallucination in extreme environments. He was deep underground, miles from any living soul, in a place steeped in dark legend. Of course, his senses would play tricks, but the clarity of the whisper, the intimate articulation of his own name, it defied simple explanation. He raised his audio recorder, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. Auditory anomaly, possible vocalization, unconfirmed source, a single word, my name, pronounced distinctly, attempting to maintain composure. His own voice, recorded, sounded thin and wavering. He turned back to the console, needing an anchor, a tangible point of focus. The amber light beckoned. It was an old-fashioned interface, a complex array of buttons, switches, and shattered screens. Dust, thick and undisturbed for decades, mounded on every surface, save for the immediate vicinity of the pulsing light. Here, a faint, circular area seemed subtly cleaner, as if something regularly brushed against it, or perhaps radiated an imperceptible energy that repelled the grime. He carefully brushed away a layer of dust from a section of the console near the light, revealing a series of faded labels. Primary reactor conduit, one read. Another, more chillingly, dimensional stabilization field. Active? Active? Impossible. The facility had been abandoned for half a century. His EMF detector, which had remained stubbornly silent, now gave a faint, intermittent spike. A low, irregular beep. It was barely above background noise, but it was something. He held the device closer to the console. The beeping intensified slightly, but still erratic, as if whatever energy it detected was fluctuating, breathing. He swept the thermal imager over the console, nothing, ambient cold. But as he moved it towards the pulsing light, the screen briefly flared with a faint, deep red, a localized heat signature, impossibly small, centered precisely on the light itself. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the blue-green wash of cold. A new sound permeated the hum, a distant, almost imperceptible creaking, like ancient timbers groaning under immense pressure. It seemed to come from deeper within the complex, from one of the many branching corridors that led away from this central chamber. It was a rhythmic sound, a slow, deliberate cadence that suggested movement. Elias felt a cold dread seep into his stomach. He wasn't alone. He couldn't be alone. He moved away from the console, choosing the widest of the remaining corridors. It was a passage into a deeper unknown, a black maw that seemed to exhale the cold. His headlamp beam, powerful as it was, struggled to penetrate the density of the darkness, making the walls seem to press in, the ceiling an unreachable void. The further he walked, the more pronounced the creaking became, evolving into a cacophony of groans and shifts, as if the very rock around him was alive, stretching, settling, or perhaps being moved. The low hum of the central chamber slowly faded, replaced by this symphony of structural agony. The air quality sensor began to beep incessantly, its display flashing, warning, anomalous gases, high concentration. The metallic, acrid scent intensified, now overlaid with something else, a faint, sickly sweetness, like decaying flowers or something organic, deeply rotten. He passed a series of smaller, identical steel doors, each one sealed tight, marked with cryptic alphanumeric codes. Some were visibly warped, their steel frames buckled as if by immense internal pressure. Others had strange, dark stains streaking down their surfaces, the color of dried blood, but with an unnatural, almost iridescent sheen. He didn't dare touch them. His footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed down the corridor, but now the phantom footsteps that mimicked his own were gone. Instead, he heard something else, a faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound just behind the range of his light, barely audible above the creaking of the structure. It was a dragging sound, wet and uneven, like something heavy being pulled across rough concrete. Elias stopped abruptly. The scraping stopped. He waited. The creaking continued, but the dragging sound was absent. He took a hesitant step forward. A fractional second later, the scraping resumed, perfectly synchronized with his movement, but always just out of sight, always behind him. He felt a profound sense of violation, of being stalked. This wasn't an echo, not a trick of the mind. This was something tangible, following him, lurking in the periphery of his awareness, just beyond the reach of his light. He began to quicken his pace, not quite running, but moving with urgency. The scraping matched his speed. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting deeper into the earth. The air grew thicker, colder, and the strange, sweet, rotten smell became cloying, almost suffocating. Suddenly, the corridor opened into another vast chamber, larger even than the central command area. This one was different. It was less a research facility and more a monumental subterranean vault. The walls were rough-hewn rock, but carved with impossible precision, forming towering arches and pillars that disappeared into the absolute darkness above. It was like an ancient, forgotten temple or a natural cathedral sculpted by some titanic force. And in the center of this cavernous space, suspended in the air by massive, rusted chains that stretched up into the unseen ceiling, was an object. Elias froze, his headlamp beam fixed on it. It was a colossal, multifaceted crystal, easily 20 feet in height, shimmering with an internal faint luminescence that seemed to absorb and distort the light he shone upon it. It was a deep, obsidian black, yet within its depths he could perceive faint, swirling patterns of iridescent violet and sickly green. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, with a low, almost subsonic throb that now completely overshadowed any other sound. This was the source of the persistent hum, the deeper, more profound vibration. Around the base of the crystal, arranged in a perfect circle, were what appeared to be 9 massive, petrified trees, their branches reaching up towards the crystal as if in supplication or agony. Their bark was like scorched stone, their leaves long since withered into dust. They were too large to have been brought in. They must have grown here or been created here. The air around the crystal was visibly distorted, shimmering like heat haze, yet it radiated an intense, bone-chilling cold. His air quality sensor went into full alarm mode, its frantic beeping a shrill counterpoint to the deep thrum. The display flashed, "Danger, extreme anomaly detected, unknown energy signature." His EMF detector, now held high, screamed. A continuous, deafening wail, indicating an electromagnetic field of staggering intensity. His thermal imager, swept across the crystal, went completely blank, overwhelmed by whatever energy emanated from the monolithic object. Elias felt a profound terror, a primordial fear that seized his diaphragm and constricted his throat. This wasn't just a research facility, it was something else entirely. A place of worship, perhaps, or a containment zone for something utterly alien. He raised his recorder, his voice barely a whisper against the shriek of the EMF detector. Unbelievable! A crystalline structure, massive, suspended in a vast cavern, emitting immense energy. This is beyond anything I've ever encountered. The Blackwood depths, the legends, they were true. As he spoke, the faint, shimmering patterns within the black crystal began to shift, to churn, the violet and green streaks swirling faster, converging. The deep throb intensified, vibrating through the soles of his boots, up his legs into his very skull. It was no longer a hum, but a resonant chord, a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the earth. And then, from the blackness beyond the crystal, from the unseen reaches of the cavern, a new sound began, a chorus of whispers. Not a single voice, but many. Dry, papery, like 1,000 brittle leaves skittering across a stone floor. They were indistinct, unintelligible, yet they carried a palpable malevolence, a chorus of ancient, hungry voices. The petrified trees around the crystal began to tremble, ever so slightly, a faint dusting of fine gray powder falling from their stone-like branches. Suddenly, a gust of impossibly cold wind swept through the cavern, carrying with it the sickeningly sweet scent of decay, now intensified to an unbearable degree. It was a freezing breath from the abyss, and as it swirled around Elias, it carried with it a distinct, horrifying sound, the scraping he had heard earlier, now amplified, clearer, closer. And this time, it was not behind him. It was ahead, coming from the very base of the colossal crystal. His headlamp beam, struggling against the pervasive darkness and the strange light absorption of the crystal, flickered. And in that brief, agonizing moment of diminished light, he saw it. At the foot of the crystal, slowly, painstakingly, a shape was emerging from the deep shadows. It was impossibly thin, angular, like a collection of sharp, broken bones draped in something dark and brittle. It moved with a disjointed, dragging motion, and as it shifted, the scraping sound intensified, revealing its source. Long, skeletal fingers, impossibly elongated, dragging across the rough stone floor. One of its limbs, impossibly long and spindly, lifted, pointing directly at him. And from the chorus of whispers that now filled the cavern, a single, amplified voice detached itself, dry and rasping, filled with a terrible hunger. "He has come. He has returned." Elias stumbled back, fear paralyzing his limbs, his mind screaming. This wasn't a shadow, not a hallucination. This was real, and it was waiting for him. The immense crystal throbbed with a sickening intensity. The whispers grew into a frantic, ecstatic din, and the skeletal form at its base began to pull itself forward, one dragging, scraping limb at a time, towards the solitary, terrified man. Part 3. Elias Thorne stumbled backward, a guttural sound of pure terror tearing from his throat. His boot caught on an unseen rise in the cavern floor, sending him sprawling. The headlamp, jolted by the impact, spun wildly, casting disorienting arcs of light across the colossal crystal, and the skeletal entity, slowly, inexorably, pulling itself from the shadows. The scraping sound intensified, no longer a mere echo, but the raw, visceral friction of bone-like appendages dragging across rough stone. The creature was a horror sculpted from nightmare. Impossibly tall and slender, its form seemed to be woven from shadows and desiccated sinew. Its limbs were too long, too numerous, jointed at unnatural angles, ending in needle-thin digits that raked the ground, leaving faint, parallel grooves in the ancient dust. What might have been a head was a featureless, elongated skull, devoid of eyes or mouth. Yet from its vicinity, the amplified, dry whisper emanated. "He has come. He has returned." It was a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the air itself, resonating not just in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. The chorus of whispers surrounding it swelled, a frantic, ecstatic din that resonated with the deep thrum of the crystal. Elias scrambled backward on hands and knees, his mind screaming for him to flee, yet his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if rooted to the frigid stone. The air was a suffocating blend of the acrid metallic tang and the cloying sweet rot, a perfume of death and alien energy. His air quality sensor shrieked, its digital readouts a chaotic scramble of undecipherable warnings. The EMF detector wailed, a banshee's cry of electromagnetic overload. The black crystal pulsed faster, its inner vortexes of violet and sickly green churning with a terrifying velocity. The petrified trees around it, like ancient sentinels, began to shed fine gray dust from their stone-like bark, a slow, silent disintegration under the influence of the crystal's accelerating energies. The entity moved with a sickening, disjointed grace, its gait more a series of deliberate, dragging jerks than fluid motion. Each scrape of its limbs was a hammer blow to Elias's sanity. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless, and its target was clear. Its featureless head seemed to tilt, an unnerving gesture that conveyed an awful, predatory attention. Finally, with a desperate surge of adrenaline, Elias forced himself to his feet. He couldn't outrun this thing if it decided to give chase, not in this labyrinthine darkness. He had to think. He had to find a way out, or at least a place to regroup. He spun, shining his headlamp wildly, searching for any escape route. The cavern was immense, its walls fading into the absolute blackness. He remembered the corridor he had entered through, his only path back to the central shaft. He turned and ran, ignoring the screaming sensors, the overwhelming cold, the nausea from the putrid air. His footsteps echoed frantically, a stark contrast to the slow, measured scrape drag that now pursued him. The whispers followed, a cloud of indistinct malice seeming to coalesce around him, pressing in from all sides. He could almost feel their cold breath on his neck, hear their dry, papery voices brushing against his ears, though no words were clear enough to be understood, only the terrifying implication of multitudinous, ancient consciousnesses. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The entity was there, a dark, spindly silhouette against the faint, shimmering light of the crystal, gaining on him with its grotesque, dragging pace. It wasn't moving quickly, but it was persistent, a nightmare made tangible. The sheer unnaturalness of its form, the impossible angles of its limbs etched themselves into his mind. He plunged back into the corridor, the wide concrete passage that had once seemed so empty now felt like a suffocating tunnel. The scrape drag intensified, closer now, echoing behind him. The air grew even thicker, heavier, making each breath a struggle. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but the terror was a potent fuel. He fumbled for his military-grade flashlight, its focused beam a concentrated spear of light, hoping it might offer some defense or distraction. He gripped it like a weapon, though he knew instinctively it would be useless. He passed the warped steel doors he'd noted earlier. One of them, its surface still streaked with the iridescent blood-like stains, seemed to hum with a faint internal vibration. As he rushed past, the door shuddered, and a faint, high-pitched wail, like a distant, suffering soul, emanated from within. He didn't stop. He couldn't. The phantom footsteps, which had vanished on his approach to the crystal chamber, were back. Not behind him, mimicking his pursuer, but ahead of him, just out of his headlamp's reach. They were light, quick, unnervingly silent, almost a patter, as if something else was fleeing alongside him, or perhaps leading him deeper into the trap. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He was caught between two unknowns, one monstrously tangible, the other an unseen presence in the suffocating darkness. He reached a junction he didn't remember. A smaller, narrower tunnel branched off to his left, barely visible in the periphery of his light. It looked darker, more constricted, but offered an immediate diversion from the main corridor. Without thinking, he veered left, hoping to throw off his pursuer, even for a moment. The narrower passage was a claustrophobic squeeze. The walls were rougher, unlined rock, dripping with icy moisture. The air was even colder, thick with the scent of damp earth and the pervasive sweet rot. The scraping sound from behind him briefly faltered, then resumed, still coming from the main corridor, but now further away. A fleeting surge of relief washed over him. He ran deeper into the narrow tunnel, the silence broken only by his ragged breathing and the dripping water. The EMF detector, which had quieted somewhat in the main corridor, now began to spike again, erratically. The air quality sensor continued its frantic alarm. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a small, circular chamber. It was clearly man-made, but crude, hastily excavated. In the center stood a single rusted metal table, littered with desiccated files and shattered glassware. A single rickety chair lay overturned beside it. This must have been a makeshift observation post, or a temporary lab, abandoned in haste. Elias slumped against a cold, damp rock wall, gasping for breath, clutching his recorder. He clicked it on, his voice a hoarse whisper. Diversion taken. Narrow passage. Temporary refuge found, I think. The entity, it was indescribable, like something from a fever dream. The whispers, the crystal, my name. It knew my name. He paused, listening intently. The scrape drag was gone. The whispers were gone. Only the distant, deep thrum of the crystal, a faint, resonant vibration through the rock, remained. He allowed himself a moment to slide down the wall, trying to regain his composure. His entire body ached, his nerves were frayed, and the cold was seeping into his very core. He swept his headlamp around the small chamber. The files on the table were too fragile to touch, crumbling at the slightest disturbance. The glassware was beyond repair. But his light caught on something else. On the far side of the chamber, almost completely obscured by shadow, was another opening. It wasn't a tunnel, but a heavy, circular metal hatch, like the entrance to a pressurized vault. It was partially ajar, a sliver of deeper blackness visible within. Curiosity, a dangerous primal drive that had brought him to this place, began to override his terror. What could be behind a reinforced hatch in a hastily built observation post? He cautiously approached the hatch, his senses on high alert. The EMF detector began to chirp again, a low, steady pulse emanating from beyond the hatch. The air quality sensor, however, remained stable, indicating cleaner air behind the metal barrier. He pushed the hatch open slowly, the heavy metal groaning on its rusted hinges, a sound that grated on his raw nerves. The opening revealed a short, downward-sloping passage lined with slick, natural rock. He shone his light inside. The passage led to a small, roughly spherical cavern, entirely natural. The walls gleamed with moisture, and tiny phosphorescent fungi clung to the rock, casting a faint, ethereal glow. In the center of this small grotto, nestled on a pedestal of natural stone, was a single, ancient artifact. It was a small, intricately carved box, no larger than a shoebox, made of an unknown, dark, lustrous wood, inlaid with what looked like chips of the same obsidian crystal that powered the monstrous artifact in the larger chamber. Strange, angular symbols, unlike any he had ever seen, were etched into its surface. As he drew closer, the EMF detector in his hand began to wail again, just as it had near the colossal crystal. The air around the box felt charged, almost alive. And then he noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible pulsation synchronized with the distant thrum of the main crystal, emanating from the small box. He reached out, his hand trembling, to touch the box. It was cold, colder than the surrounding air, radiating a profound chill that seeped into his gloved fingertips. As his fingers made contact with the ancient wood, the inlay of obsidian crystal chips flared with a faint, internal violet light, mirroring the patterns in the monstrous crystal. And then, from the small box, a whisper rose. Not a chorus, not a dry rasp, but a single, clear, resonant voice. It was ancient, sorrowful, yet filled with an undeniable power, and it spoke directly into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. You have disturbed the slumber, the warden has stirred. The words reverberated through his skull, a chilling pronouncement that seemed to unlock a deeper, more primal fear. The warden, was that the skeletal entity? Was this box a key? A warning? Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet shuddered violently. A deep, resonant crack echoed through the grotto, coming from the walls themselves. He looked up, his headlamp beam frantically searching. A hairline fissure, glowing with an ominous, sickly green light, appeared on the rock wall just above the box, and began to widen rapidly. And from that deepening crack, a thin, skeletal hand, impossibly long and sharp-fingered, began to slowly emerge, reaching for the box, reaching for him. It was the same hand he had seen dragging across the stone floor of the cathedral cavern, now impossibly close, impossibly real. The whispers, now a frantic chorus, erupted from the crack directly behind the reaching hand. He had not escaped. He had walked directly into its lair. Part 4. The skeletal hand, impossibly long and unnaturally jointed, pushed further through the deepening fissure in the rock wall. Its needle-sharp digits splayed, reaching with deliberate slowness for the obsidian box. The crack itself pulsed with an ominous, sickly green light, and from its depths the dry, papery chorus of whispers swelled, a cacophony of ancient voices that seemed to scream with frantic urgency. Elias Thorne recoiled, a strangled cry trapped in his throat. The voice from the box had been a chilling pronouncement. You have disturbed the slumber. The warden has stirred. Now, the warden itself was manifesting,
not from the open cavern, but from within the very rock, as if the mountain itself was its prison, and his presence had granted it a momentary, terrifying breach. The hand, a nightmare made flesh and bone, continued its agonizingly slow emergence.
Its surface was not bone, he realized with a fresh wave of nausea, but a substance that resembled petrified wood, dark and gnarled, yet with the unnerving sheen of polished obsidian. It was ancient, alien, and utterly malevolent. The fingers, too thin to be natural, twitched, their tips scraping against the rough stone of the fissure, a sound that drilled into his skull. The small grotto, once a momentary reprieve, was now a trap. The air grew impossibly cold. The phosphorescent fungi on the walls flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with unseen life.
The ground beneath his feet shuddered again, a more violent tremor this time, and another hairline crack, glowing with the same eerie green, snaked across the ceiling, dripping icy moisture onto his upturned face. His mind, battered and frayed, struggled to comprehend. This was not merely paranormal, it was a cosmic horror, a violation of natural law. The crystalline box, nestled on its stone pedestal, pulsed faster, its obsidian inlays flaring with violet light, as if in agonized communication with the colossal crystal in the main chamber, and perhaps with the entity emerging from the wall. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that he could not allow that hand to touch the box.
Whatever connection existed between the two, it was vital, and whatever the warden sought to achieve with it, it could not be good. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Elias shoved the box from its pedestal. It wasn't heavy, but the act was clumsy, born of pure panic. The box tumbled onto the damp stone floor with a muffled thud. As it fell, the violet light from its inlays flared once, blindingly bright, then dimmed, almost extinguishing. The chorus of whispers from the fissure shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and frustration. The emerging hand twitched violently, its reach falling short of the box. He didn't wait. He spun and plunged back towards the half-open metal hatch, desperate to escape this suffocating chamber. The voice from the box, now a faint, receding whisper in his mind, uttered a single, chilling word: mistake. He burst through the hatch, slamming it shut behind him with all his strength. The heavy metal clang resonated through the narrow tunnel, followed by a series of dull thuds from the other side, as if something immense was pressing against it. The metal buckled slightly inward, groaning under the unseen pressure. He didn't stop. He ran, scrambling back up the narrow, dripping passage, his headlamp beam bouncing wildly. The air quality sensor, still beeping furiously, now registered a sudden sharp drop in oxygen levels. The cold intensified, a palpable presence that gnawed at his flesh. He reached the makeshift observation chamber, the overturned chair and rusted table still in disarray. He glanced back at the metal hatch. It was still holding, but the dull thuds continued, more rhythmic now, heavier, interspersed with a sickening creak of stressed metal. He could hear the whispers again, muffled by the steel, but growing in intensity, pressing against the barrier. He had to get out. He had to reach the central shaft, climb back to the surface. He was no longer an archivist, a documentarian. He was prey. He burst out of the narrow tunnel and back into the main concrete corridor. The distant thrum of the colossal crystal was still there, but now it felt different, imbued with a frantic urgency, a building crescendo. And the scraping sound, the dreaded scrape-drag, was back. Not behind him from the direction of the metal hatch, but ahead of him, echoing down the corridor he needed to traverse to reach the central chamber. The warden was moving. It had found another way. Panic threatened to unravel him completely. He was trapped in a subterranean maze with an entity that defied comprehension, an entity that seemed capable of traversing solid rock. He scanned the corridor desperately. The phantom footsteps, the light, quick patter were also back, ahead of him, weaving through the deeper shadows, just out of his light's reach. Were they leading him or hurting him? He forced himself to move, to run towards the central chamber, towards what he now saw as his only chance of escape, however slim. The scrape-drag grew louder, closer. The whispers, too, were more distinct now, not a single voice, but a multitude, a dry, papery rustle of voices that seemed to coil around him, pressing into his mind, no longer unintelligible. He opens the way. The slumber broken. The sunken cathedral rises. The words, alien and ancient, burrowed into his consciousness, twisting his perceptions. The corridor itself seemed to warp, the concrete walls stretching and contracting, the shadows deepening into impossible chasms. He was losing his grip on reality. He rounded a bend in the corridor, and there it was. Not the full entity, not yet. But an impossibly long, spindly arm reaching out from the shadows ahead, its needle-like fingers splayed, scraping against the concrete floor, beckoning him forward. It was a ghastly welcome, an invitation into hell. Elias swerved, crashing into one of the sealed steel doors that lined the corridor. His shoulder slammed against the cold metal, sending a jolt of pain through him. The door warped and streaked with the iridescent, blood-like stains, buckled inward with a hollow groan. And from within, the faint, high-pitched wail he had heard earlier intensified, a chorus of suffering, desperate and chilling. He saw a brief flash of sickly green light through a hairline crack in the doorframe. He pushed off the door, frantic, almost collapsing. The arm ahead retreated, melting back into the shadows, only to re-emerge further down the corridor, a silent, mocking guide. He had to make a choice, confront the warden or find another way. His eyes darted to the buckled door he had just hit. A chance, a desperate, terrifying chance. He fumbled for his multi-tool, his fingers clumsy with fear and cold. He worked frantically at the archaic locking mechanism, praying it would give. The distant thuds from the metal hatch and the scrape-drag from ahead both grew louder, closing in. He could hear the whispers, now a frantic chant, echoing through the corridor, pressing in from all sides. The sacrifice, the offering. With a final desperate wrench, the ancient lock on the buckled door groaned, then clicked open. A gust of incredibly cold, putrid air exhaled from within, laden with the sickeningly sweet scent of decay and something else. A metallic tang, like copper and blood, but infinitely older, infinitely more potent. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the heavy door inward, revealing a pitch-black chamber, even darker than the corridor, a void that seemed to suck the light from his headlamp. The high-pitched wail from within intensified, now accompanied by a faint, wet, slithering sound. He stumbled inside, slamming the heavy steel door shut behind him. The metallic clang echoed, followed by the immediate, overwhelming darkness. He was sealed in. The EMF detector shrieked, a continuous, deafening alarm. The air quality sensor instantly went into critical alert, flashing deadly gases, immediate evacuation. The cold was unimaginable, an icy grip that seemed to crush his bones. He swept his headlamp beam around the chamber, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a research lab or a control room. It was a containment cell, and it was filled with them. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of desiccated, humanoid figures, suspended in various states of decay, hung from the ceiling by thick, translucent tendrils that pulsed with a faint, sickly green light. They were shriveled, mummified husks, their skin like parchment, their mouths open in silent, eternal screams. Some were complete, others were fragmented, mere torsos or limbs, grotesquely preserved. They looked like ancient, withered corpses, but their forms were subtly wrong, their limbs too long, their heads too small, a disturbing echo of the warden's own unnatural anatomy. And they were all whispering. Not dry, papery whispers, but a collective, resonant hum of sorrow and fear, 1,000 voices lamenting in unison, their sound absorbed by the very air. This was the source of the high-pitched wail, amplified by the sheer number of these entombed horrors. As his light passed over them, some of the figures twitched. A faint internal glow, a sickly green, flickered within their desiccated eye sockets. One, suspended directly in his path, its skeletal fingers brushing against his face, slowly, agonizingly, turned its mummified head towards him. Its jaw, a gaping void, slowly opened wider, and from its depths a single, clear voice, imbued with an ancient, unbearable pain, pierced the chorus of whispers. "The gate! He opened the gate!" The words were not spoken aloud, but resonated directly within his mind, a psychic scream of despair. And then, from the far wall of the containment chamber, where the thick tendrils converged into a massive, pulsating mass of sickly green light, a new sound began. A rhythmic thump, thump. It was deep, guttural, resonating through the rock, through his very chest. It was the sound of something immense, something organic and alive, beating. A colossal, unseen heart. The warden's heart. The tendrils holding the desiccated figures began to pulse faster. The sickly green light intensified, and the figures themselves, hundreds of them, began to stir, their shriveled limbs twitching, their heads slowly turning, their empty eye sockets fixing on Elias Thorne. He was trapped in a tomb of the undead, with the heart of his tormentor beating just beyond the wall, and the whispers, now a desperate plea, filling his mind. Close the gate before it is too late. Part 5.
Elias Thorne stumbled backward, a guttural gasp choked by the overwhelming stench and cold. The containment cell was a macabre gallery of silent screams. Hundreds of desiccated figures, suspended by pulsing, sickly green tendrils, swayed with an unnerving, barely perceptible motion. Their vacant eye sockets now flickering with that same sickly green light locked onto him 1,000 silent judgments. The collective hum of their whispers intensified, no longer a lament, but a chorus of urgent, desperate pleas that burrowed directly into his mind. The gate is opening, they cried, a psychic cacophony that threatened to shatter his sanity. He opened the gate, you must close it. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump from beyond the far wall of the chamber grew stronger, louder, resonating through the very bedrock, a colossal, unseen heart beating in time with his own frantic pulse. The tendrils holding the husks began to pulse with greater intensity, their sickly green glow casting grotesque dancing shadows across the mummified forms. Some of the figures twitched more violently, their brittle limbs scraping against each other, a dry, papery rustle that added to the terrifying din. The steel door he had slammed shut behind him groaned under a sudden immense pressure. A series of deep metallic booms reverberated through the chamber, as if a titanic fist was pounding against it. The warden was trying to get in, or perhaps get out. Elias was trapped between a restless army of the dead and a monstrous entity whose heart pulsed through solid rock, whose touch was petrification, and whose whispers could drive a man mad. He had to think. The whispers of the husks, though terrifying, offered a single, unifying command: close the gate. But what was the gate? The colossal crystal in the main cavern? And how did one close it? The obsidian box. The small, carved box from the grotto, whose voice had warned him, whose inlay had pulsed in sync with the crystal. He had knocked it to the ground. It was still in the grotto, beyond the metal hatch. He glanced at the spectral forms surrounding him. They were stirring, their collective consciousness focused solely on him. Their whispers, sharper now, more insistent, were filled with a terrible urgency. The key is lost. Retrieve the key. The warden's pounding on the door intensified, the steel groaning, beginning to buckle inward. He didn't have much time. He had to go back through the grotto, past the place where the skeletal hand had emerged, retrieve the box, and then, somehow, make his way back to the crystal chamber. It was a suicidal plan, but the only one that offered a sliver of hope. With a desperate resolve, Elias turned towards the metal hatch leading back to the grotto. The husks parted slightly, their whispers taking on a new, almost pleading tone. "Hurry, the awakening, it is upon us." He pushed the hatch open. The metallic shriek of its rusted hinges seemed impossibly loud. He squeezed through the opening, plunging back into the narrow, dripping passage. He didn't dare look back at the containment cell, but he could feel the pressure of 1,000 dead eyes on his back, urging him onward. The grotto was even colder, the phosphorescent fungi now glowing with a frantic, pulsing rhythm. The fissure in the wall, where the skeletal hand had emerged, was wider, jagged, glowing with a sickening green light. The thump, thump, thump of the warden's heart was fainter here, but still a profound tremor in the earth. He scanned the damp stone floor. There it was, the obsidian box, lying where he had knocked it, its dark wood dull, its crystal inlays completely dark. It looked inert, powerless. As he reached for it, the fissure in the wall widened further, with a sickening crack, and a cascade of small stones and icy dust tumbled down. The skeletal hand, more of the arm now visible, began to push through the opening again, its needle-thin fingers reaching, twitching with renewed purpose. A faint, dry whisper, distinct from the husks, emanated from the fissure. "Mine." Elias snatched the box, pressing it against his chest. As his fingers closed around the dark wood, the obsidian inlays flared to life, not with violet, but with a vibrant, pulsating green light, mirroring the glow of the fissure and the tendrils in the containment cell. The box grew impossibly cold in his hand, radiating an ancient, potent energy. The single resonant voice from the box, ancient and sorrowful, returned to his mind. "The key. It activates the prison. It closes the gate." He heard the faint scrape drag from the mouth of the grotto, beyond the metal table. The warden was coming from the other direction. He was surrounded. He had to move. He scrambled out of the grotto, holding the glowing box tight. The narrow passage stretched ahead, dark and treacherous. He could hear the low, guttural growl of the warden from the main corridor, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. He burst into the main corridor. The warden was there, a towering, spindly silhouette against the faint, shimmering light from the distant crystal chamber. It moved with unnatural speed now, its dragging limbs propelling it forward, each scrape a prelude to his demise. The chorus of whispers, its voice, filled the corridor. "You hold the key. You released the gate. The sacrifice must be made." Elias ran, fueled by pure terror and the desperate hope that the box held a solution. The green light from the box pulsed in his hand, casting grotesque shadows that danced ahead of him. He could feel the energy emanating from it, a cold, vibrant power thrumming through his arm. He reached the central chamber, the vast, cathedral-like space dominated by the colossal obsidian crystal. It pulsed with a frantic, blinding intensity now, its inner vortexes of violet and sickly green churning violently. The petrified trees around its base were rapidly disintegrating, shedding dust and fragments, their stone-like bark crumbling under the immense energy. The low thrum was a deafening roar, vibrating through his entire being. The warden was close behind him, its scrape drag almost upon him. Elias knew he had only moments. He staggered towards the crystal, the green light of the box blazing in his hand. He could see the intricate markings on the crystal's surface, patterns he hadn't noticed before, swirls and glyphs that mirrored the strange symbols on the box. It was a lock, and the box was the key. He reached the base of the crystal, gasping for breath, his vision blurring from the cold, the fear, and the overwhelming energy. The warden was just behind him, its spindly shadow falling over him. He could feel its cold, dry breath on his neck, the whispers now a frantic, triumphant roar in his mind. The cycle turns, the gate demands. With a final desperate act, Elias pressed the obsidian box against the surface of the colossal crystal. A blinding flash of green light erupted, searing his vision, followed by a deafening roar that was not sound, but pure, raw force. The ground beneath him buckled, the very air screamed, and the entire cavern was bathed in an unholy emerald glow. The crystal shrieked, a sound of unimaginable pain, and began to pulse erratically, its inner vortexes churning with chaotic fury. The green light from the box flowed into the crystal, merging with its dark obsidian surface. The petrified trees around the base disintegrated completely, collapsing into mounds of gray dust. The warden, poised to strike, froze. Its whispers, now a panicked shriek, tore through the air. No! The prison! Not the gate! The prison! The colossal crystal began to twist, to contract, its immense mass seeming to fold in on itself. The green light pulsed faster, then faded, replaced by a deep, hungry violet. The energy, instead of diminishing, intensified, drawing inwards, creating a powerful, irresistible vacuum that pulled at everything in the chamber. Elias felt himself being drawn forward, irresistibly, towards the contracting crystal. The box, still fused to the crystal surface, pulled him closer. He tried to resist, but his muscles were useless, his will swallowed by the overwhelming force. The whispers of the husks from the distant containment cell, now faint and receding, echoed in his mind, tinged with a chilling finality. He closes the gate. He becomes the gate. As the crystal continued its terrifying contraction, pulling him closer, Elias finally understood. He hadn't opened the gate, he had merely entered, disturbed its slumber. And the whispers, "He has come, he has returned," were not about his return as Elias Thorne. They were about the return of the catalyst, the necessary component for the cycle. The warden wasn't just a monster, it was a previous victim or a guardian bound to the crystal. The box wasn't just a key, it was a conduit, a siphon. And the gate wasn't just a portal, it was a prison. A prison for something immense, something ancient, something that fed on what was given to it. And now the crystal was taking him. He saw his own reflection in the obsidian surface of the contracting crystal, distorted, elongating, his form blurring, merging with the swirling violet and green. He felt a profound, agonizing transformation beginning, his very essence being stretched, pulled, integrated. His limbs felt impossibly long, his skin hardening, his mind expanding, yet shrinking, dissolving into a collective consciousness of sorrow and endless watching. The last thing Elias Thorne saw before his eyes were consumed by the swirling darkness of the crystal was the warden. It stood motionless, its skeletal form slowly turning to stone, petrifying, its whispers fading into a final desolate sigh that resonated in his emerging, crystalline mind. The new warden, the new prison, the cycle continues. The colossal crystal, now glowing with a deep internal violet light, finished its contraction, becoming a perfectly smooth obsidian sphere, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic thrum. The chamber fell silent, save for the faint, resonant vibration emanating from the sphere. The sunken Cathedral of Whispers was quiet once more. The gate was closed. And Elias Thorne, the documentarian of the forgotten, had become the forgotten, the new silent guardian of the ancient horror, waiting for the next disturbance, the next return, the next turning of the cycle in the infinite, cold darkness of Project Umbra.